What's going on, family? I'm Scrapbook Boxing, Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuff series. I'm going to continue to examine 100 years of the greatest 150 black fighters of all times. Now, Curtis Anderson and I are both working on this project together. And we realize that there are some fighters that should be on the list that may not fit the criteria. So what is the criteria? What's to be expected for a man to be added on this list? When we look at the era in which he came, his achievements and his accomplishments, how did he handle certain circumstances? What went on during his day? Why was he not able to get an opportunity to fight certain fighters or even for the championship? We took all that in consideration. And we took a look at some of the men that was in the eras of the problems in which they came. And that's how we added these fighters. But the problem is 100 black fighters was really not going to be enough, to be fair, because what we wanted to do was put men in all eras on this list. So I decided to add an additional 50 fighters. So that's how you come up with 150 greatest black fighters of all times. So the 50 fighters that's been added will be men such as Gil Turner of Philadelphia. Be men such as Bad Benny Briscoe of Philadelphia. Ivan Robinson of Philadelphia. Reuben Hurricane Carter, Georgie Benton. Benton is from Philadelphia. How ironic is that? But that's just an example of certain fighters that should be added to the list. They just did not fit the criteria. They were not champions. They didn't get to fight some of the fights that would put them in that position. No fault of their own. So I just hope I was clear on the 150 greatest black fighters that will be on the list, because it originally began with 100 greatest black fighters within the last 100 years. So I just wanted to clear that up. So right now we're looking at a fighter by the name of Charles A.C. Smith. He's on the original greatest 100 black fighters of all times. His name was the Black Thunderbolt. You can even call him the Michigan Thunderbolt. He was born May 3rd, 1860 in Macon, Georgia. He died October 1st, 1924. He was 64 years of age at the time of his death, and he would reside in Buffalo, New York. Now, he stood 5'11" 3/4 inches, and he weighed 170 pounds. By 1884, Smith faced great fighters, such as Black Diamond, Harry Woodson. He was born January 1st, 1858, Cincinnati, Ohio, and he died September 20th, 1887, in St. Paul, Minnesota. Now, the Black Diamond stood 5'7.5" inches. He was 29 years of age at the time of his death. Now, A.C. Smith would also take on fighters such as Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler. He was born April 1st, 1868, Columbus, Ohio. He died January 1st, 1943, in Harlem, New York. He had a record of 143 total bouts, 76 wins, 50 losses, 49 knockouts, and he was stopped 17 times. Let's take a look at the 17 knockouts that he was involved in. Most of those knockouts that he suffered were not knockouts or technical knockouts. There were situations where if he went more than 6 rounds, they would consider it a knockout. Or if he didn't meet certain criteria, we'll better say, they would consider it a technical knockout. So these records that we examine very closely, we have to understand why they are the way they are. A.C. Smith would also take on fighters such as Professor Charles Hadley. He was born September 30th, 1846, Nashville, Tennessee. He died June 28th, 1897, St. Paul, Minnesota. He stood 5'9" inches and he was a heavyweight. Now, while making the tours around the country, in 1896, Charles A.C. Smith took on all comers, took on some exhibitions as well as fights. And he was in the ring with men such as Professor Charles Hadley, Bridgeport, Connecticut. And that fight would go 9 rounds. It was a bare-knuckle fight. We take on Abe Brown Albany, New York, 10 rounds. Steve Williams of Hudson, New York. The fight went 4 rounds. Jack Stewart of Canada. Fight went 4 rounds. Bob Taub of Norfolk, Virginia. That fight went 6 rounds. It was in the ring with Steve Taylor, Brooklyn, New York, 14 rounds. And Frank Craig, the Harlem Coffee Cooler, 2 rounds. He took on heavyweight Jewish Joe Chowinski. That name sounds familiar to you. If not, it will, as we discuss fighters such as Jack Johnson, because he knocked out Jack Johnson in 3 rounds. And a year before that, he himself was knocked out by the Barbados Demon, Joe Walcott. Joe Chowinski had faced Gentleman Jim Corbett many times. In fact, it was a neighborhood rivalry. We'll get to that at a later time. A.C. Smith was also in the ring with George Godfrey. Called him Little Chocolate. Fought him in Boston, New York. He was also in the ring with Joe Butler, Philadelphia, 2 rounds. Brooklyn Strong Boy, 1 round. And Melvin Thompson in 3 rounds. Mike Green, 29 rounds, with gloves. The fight took place in Boston Athletic Club. His last fight was with Peter Maher, 6 rounds in Buffalo, New York, June 20th, 1882. Peter Maher was the defense of Bob Fitzsimmons for his heavyweight championship crown. So you see, there are examples like this when you have a man who rightly deserves to be recognized as one of the greatest black fighters in boxing history. On behalf of my brother Curtis Anderson and myself, Scrapbook Boxing, I want to thank you for joining us in examining 150 of the greatest black fighters within the last 100 years. Now, the next fight I want to talk about is the Black Prince Peter Jackson. He was born July 3rd, 1861, U.S. Virgin Islands, St. Croix. He would die July 13th, 1901. Sydney, they called it the New South. He was in Wales, Australia. He was 40 years of age at the time of his death. Now, Peter Jackson stood 6 foot 1.5 inches. He had a 77-inch reach. Had recorded records of 78 fights, 42 wins, 5 losses, 29 knockouts. He would be stopped 3 times himself and had 3 draws, and the rest would be no decisions and no contests. He fought between 1882 and 1899. He became the colored heavyweight champion August 24th, 1888. He scored a technical knockout, 19 rounds, with Little Chocolate, George Godfrey. And George Godfrey was a phenomenal fighter himself. He challenged John O'Sullivan to a contest. And John O'Sullivan had not yet drew the caller line. He said to George Godfrey's camp, "Give me to 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and we'll telegraph you the contract." But 3 o'clock in the afternoon, George Godfrey did not hear from John O'Sullivan. So he contacted the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. And they would have their fight. And what a fight that would be, my God. 19 rounds of brutality. So Peter Jackson would have his last fight May 30th, 1892. And he would stop Frank Slavin. That would be his last fight of significance. He would soon hang up the gloves, and the belt would become vacated. The man who would pick up that title would be Bob Armstrong, the king of the Battle Royale. Peter Jackson had a cousin by the name of Peter Felix. And Peter Felix would take on Jack Johnson, many others. But the Black Prince, Peter Jackson, would go 61 rounds with Gentleman Jim Corbett, May 21st, 1891. Peter Jackson was winning the fight And they kept allowing the fight to go round after round because they were expecting for Peter Jackson to gas out. He never did. So they wound up making it a draw after 61 rounds. Gentleman Jim Corbett was already contracted and expected behind closed doors to take on John O'Sullivan. Peter Jackson would never get that fight because John O'Sullivan had drew the color line after George Godfrey would challenge him. Another misfortune for the black fighter coming up. When you look at their records and they didn't fight for titles, it wasn't because they did not want to. Because they were not allowed to. That's just unfortunate. Peter Jackson would become the Australian heavyweight champion, as well as the colored heavyweight champion. He was a dynamic fighter. Beautiful boxing skills he would have. Just unfortunate that he came around at the wrong time in boxing history. Scrapbook boxing. Curtis Anderson. 100 years. The greatest 150 black fighters in boxing history. Thanks for joining me. We'll talk about the next fight in one moment. Right here on the Museum of the Forgotten Fisticuffs series. Now, George Godfrey be another fighter that would be added to this list. He was born February 23rd, 1883. Defeated Charles Hadley in 6 rounds by knocking him out. The Old Chocolate, with a Boston George, was George Godfrey's name. He was born March 30th, 1853. Charlotte's own Prince Edward Island, Canada. He died October 17th, 1901. He was 48 years of age at the time of his death, and he would resign. And born Massachusetts. He would suffer from tuberculosis, as would Joe Gans of Baltimore. George Godfrey stood 5 foot 10 and a half inches. He was a heavyweight and fought from 1879 to 1896. He'd be named Little Chocolate. Oh, what a fighter he was. And I talked about the Black Prince, Peter Jackson. Well, that's the man he fought. 19 rounds. And he would lose his colored heavyweight championship belt that he would win from Charles Hadley to the Black Prince Peter Jackson. George Godfrey would be added to this list because of his accomplishments and the manner in which he fought during the time that he fought him. What a fighter George Godfrey was. Let us not forget a great fighter like George Godfrey. Little Chocolate. 100 years. Greatest 150 black fighters of all times. George Godfrey.